All right, good afternoon. Thank you very much, those of you who actually managed to make it back from the very crowded food court. Appreciate you being here. Hopefully a few more folks will trickle in as I go. I have like 40 minutes of content and like a 26-minute time slot. So I'm going to be going a little bit fast. These slides are going to be on my blog, so take notes, but the slides will be up later. Don't worry about it too much. I am a senior front-end engineer at Replay, where we're building a true time-traveling debugger for JavaScript applications. It is amazing. It can save you so much time debugging. Please check it out if you haven't had a chance to, or come talk to me later. I'll be happy to tell you how amazing it is. I'm known for a few different things online. I spend a lot of time answering questions pretty much anywhere there is a text box on the internet. I collect all kinds of useful and interesting links to resources. I write extremely long blog posts, and I am a Redux maintainer. I've done a lot of work on the various Redux libraries and our docs, but most people know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar pretty much everywhere on the internet. All right, so Redux came out in 2015. And there's been a lot of different complaints about Redux over the years. There's too much boilerplate. It's too hard to set up a store. I have to write all these spread operations to do immutable updates. I have to add all these other packages to make it do anything useful. And these are very valid concerns. And Redux got really popular for a couple of years, and then there was kind of like this backlash starting in 2017. And people have said, Redux is dead, Redux is dying. But there were very real concerns that people brought up about the pain points of using Redux in an application. And it's worth taking a step back and asking, well, why did all this boilerplate even exist? Redux does intentionally add a level of indirection to your applications. The idea of dispatching an action that triggers an update instead of just writing, state.value equals 1, 2, 3, means that you have to do a little more work to perform an update. And Dan Abramov said, Redux's goal is not to be like the shortest way to do things. The goal is to make it predictable and easy to understand where, when, why, and how state is changing in your application. Beyond that, the conventions and the patterns shown in the Redux docs over the years really were very verbose, and people did what the docs were telling them to do. And along with that, the JavaScript language has limits, and JavaScript is mutable by default, but Redux wants you to do things like immutable updates, and that takes more work. Spread the objects, slice the arrays. And finally, Redux was designed to be a small library with an ecosystem of add-ons built around it. So there was very little built into the Redux core by default. So the way I like to think about this is that there's some complexity that is inherent to the system. Like if you took away the idea of dispatching actions, it's not Redux anymore. You cannot change that part. But a lot of this complexity was incidental. It wasn't necessary. You might have seen Redux applications where you've got code spread amongst many different folders by type. So you've got reducers/todos.js, actions/todos.js, constants/todos.js. And there are reasons why you might want to organize the code that way, but it wasn't required. Nothing about Redux makes you do that. And so there were all these different patterns that led to people needing to write a lot of code to use Redux. And frankly, it was pretty painful. So the idea is, what if we could remove all this incidental complexity and make it a lot easier to learn and use Redux? So in 2019, we created a package called Redux Toolkit from the Redux team, and it was kind of inspired by Create React App, where it includes a bunch of good defaults out of the box, takes this thing that used to be really hard to set up, and makes it a lot easier. So our goals were handle all the common use cases out of the box, look at all the things that people are trying to do with Redux and make them a lot simpler and shorter to do. We've also spent a lot of time trying to work on our TypeScript types to make it a lot easier to use Redux with TypeScript. And the goal is that Redux Toolkit is good for all Redux users. It's great for someone who is just getting started with Redux on day one, or someone who's been using it since 2015 and has a large existing code base. So let's do a quick tour through what is included in Redux Toolkit, what these APIs are designed to solve, and how you can use them in an application. The first method is called configure store. Now, if you've ever tried to set up a Redux store, you've probably seen there's like 20, 30, 40 lines of code that end up getting copy-pasted into every project. You need to combine the reducers and apply the middleware and configure the Redux dev tools and maybe add a couple other things into the setup. And granted, it's only one file per project, but there's a bunch of different things that you have to do. So Redux Toolkit includes an API called configure store that does all that work for you out of the box. It takes a single argument that's an object, so it's easier to see what parameters you're passing in. And if you look at this example, we're passing in a couple different slice reducers as part of this reducer field, and it's going to automatically combine those together. Along with that, it also automatically added the Redux Thunk middleware. It also automatically added the Redux dev tools. And so all those things are done, and you notice all we have is one simple function call, and it gives you a Redux store, and it's set up the right way. One of our other goals for Redux Toolkit is that it still has all the power and flexibility that you would have had from trying to write Redux code by hand. So configure store takes a number of different options. You can still pass in different kinds of middleware. You can pass in configuration options for the Redux dev tools, pass in an initial state value. So all the things that you could have done from setting up a Redux store by hand are still possible. It's just a lot easier to pass all that in. Now, Redux asks you to do immutable updates in your reducers. And as I said a minute ago, JavaScript is not set up for immutability by default, which means if you need to update deeply nested state, you end up doing this. Copy the state, spread the nested value, map this array, slice that. It's annoying, it's painful, and it's really easy to make mistakes. Historically, the #1 cause of Redux bugs has been accidental mutations, and a lot of it is because writing that code is really hard. There is a fantastic library from Michelle Westrate, the author of the MobX library, and it's called Immer. And with Immer, you call this produce function, pass in your original value, and a callback. And the callback gets what looks like the original data, but inside that callback, you can write code that mutates the value. Immer watches those mutations, tracks them, and turns it into a safe and correct immutable update exactly as if you did all the spreads yourself. Immer is wonderful. I love Immer. In fact, I am quoted at the top of the Immer docs saying how much I love that library. Well, Redux Toolkit builds in Immer by default. For some reason, a lot of people hate switch statements. I'm still not entirely sure why, but there are people yelling about how they hate Redux because they have to write switch statements in the reducers. I don't know. So basically, everybody at some point wrote their own little utility that takes an object where the keys are Redux type strings and the values are functions to handle those cases. So Redux Toolkit includes one of those. It's called create reducer, but inside it uses Immer. So you can mutate the data inside the reducer and it works correctly. There's also a utility called create action. I guess technically it's create action creator behavior-wise, but you call it, it creates an action creator function, and when you run the creator, it takes the payload. It's just saving you a couple lines of code. But in practice, you won't actually end up using either of these in your app because we have another layer on top of that. When you write your code, what really matters is the reducer functions. The action creators and the action type strings are really just like implementation details. So the standard way to use Redux Toolkit is with this function called createSlice. You give it a name string, initial state, and an object full of these reducer functions. And you give those functions good names like to-do added or to-do toggled. It uses immer inside, so you can still mutate the state and have it work right. And Redux Toolkit automatically generates the action creator functions. You don't have to write, const add to do equals add to do anymore. So this would be a pretty typical example right here. We have the reducers defined inside of createSlice. We export the action creators and the reducer that manages all these, hook it up, and it's good to go. createSlice also has a number of other options. For example, if you want to handle other actions that were defined in other parts of the application, there's a field called extra reducers. You can also match against multiple action types at once or provide a default value. And this was especially designed to work very well with TypeScript. With Redux, we typically use a library called reselect to derive data using memo-wise selector functions. Redux Toolkit just re-exports that same function, and then we use it internally inside Redux Toolkit in a few different places. Historically, there's been a standard pattern for data fetching where you dispatch an action before you make the request so that you can show a loading spinner or something like that. And then you dispatch another action after the request is done with either the success or the failure. It's been a very standard pattern shown in our docs for years. So Redux Toolkit includes an API called createAsyncThunk that does that work for you. You give it a string prefix and the function that does the async request, and it automatically generates and dispatches the various actions for you. So it's, again, just taking things that people were already doing with Redux and simplifying it down and shortening your own code. Another thing we've talked about in the docs is this idea of normalizing data, being able to look up items by ID. So you have a whole bunch of items, you put them in an object, you use the IDs as the keys, and we have an API called createEntityAdapter that helps with that pattern of taking an array of items and turning it into an object full of items. It includes pre-built reducers for doing kind of like your CRUD operations, add the items, update the items, remove the items, etc. But even with createAsyncThunk and createSlice, data fetching can still be kind of a pain. You'd still have to write the reducers that know how to manage the data. You have to add some use effects to kick off the request, have a use selector in your component to read the data. There's still a decent amount of work here. And what we've seen over the years is that people aren't even so much concerned about the idea of state management anymore. What we really care about is data fetching and caching of values that are on the server. And Tanner Lindsley of the React query library has talked about this a lot. Like, server state is what a lot of our applications are dealing with, not client-side state. You've always been able to fetch data and store it in Redux as a cache, but you had to do a lot of that work yourself. So about 2 years ago, we added another major API to Redux Toolkit called RTK Query. And it takes a lot of inspiration from other data fetching libraries in the ecosystem, like Apollo and React Query and Urkel and SWR, but it's built on top of Redux and Redux Toolkit. So RTK Query is a purpose-built data fetching and caching solution for Redux applications. The idea is you set up a single chunk of code that knows how to cache data in your Redux store. you define a series of endpoints that say, here's where I get my, my to-dos, my Pokemon, my users, whatever your data type is. And then it will automatically generate the logic needed to fetch the data, cache it in the store, and React hooks that you can call in your component to get the data right away. So in this example, we define an API slice called Pokemon API. We've got one query endpoint called getPokemon. We'll assume this is a REST-style API, so we construct the URL based on the name of the Pokemon, and it automatically generates a hook for us called use getPokemon by name query. And then I can just call that in my component, and I get the data and the loading flags, and I didn't have to worry about writing any of this other code to manage my data fetching. A couple other great things about RTK query. It works out of the box with REST APIs. You just provide a URL, but it's very flexible. You can work with GraphQL. You can work with other SDKs like like Firebase or Supabase or whatever else, and it'll still manage all that fetching and caching for you. You just tell it, here's how you fetch the data. And this is specifically designed to replace all the data fetching code that you would have written yourself in a Redux application. So normally you would have a single API slice in the entire application with many different endpoints defined inside of that. That file could get kind of large, so we do have code splitting abilities which you can use regardless of whether you're lazy loading it or not. You can split the endpoint definitions across many files if you want to. RTK query is specifically designed as a non-normalized document cache. So something like Apollo, like if I fetch a to-do in like a single entry and I fetch a to-do in like an array, it's going to try to deduplicate that data. RTK query does not do that. It's just whatever the server returned is what we're going to store for this cache key. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One, we think it's a simpler mental model for developers to use. Also, writing caches is really, really hard, and we don't want to get any more involved with that than we have to. It offers a lot of options for being able to pull specific pieces out from the caches, and it also has some unique features. We've got this idea of a cache entry lifecycle where you can kick off more code after the first request for a particular cache entry, or as more requests are made for that same cache entry, and even set up things like streaming requests. Maybe we fetch the initial list of messages for a chat channel and then stream in more requests over a WebSocket to update the cache entry. While we don't have specific examples of this in the docs, I have definitely seen people use RTK query with the new React router data loading APIs as well. Another thing people have done with Redux over the years is try to write code that is reactive. They want to run code when a specific action is dispatched or when a particular piece of state changes. And traditionally, they would have used either the Redux Saga library or the Redux Observable library. Both of those are very, very powerful tools, but they're also extremely complex. With Redux Saga, you have to work with generator functions. With Redux Observable, you have to work with reactjs. And frankly, those are like, I don't know, trying to use a chainsaw to cut a hammer, I don't know, bad analogy. They're a lot more powerful than what you need for most tasks. So we introduced a new API called the listener middleware, which solves that same case of when this action is dispatched or when this state changes, go run this bit of code. And it uses very typical async await behavior. It's got some very nifty built-in functionality, and it's pretty small bundle size-wise, and it works well with TypeScript. So listeners are able to match against specific actions or state changes. We do have some nice built-ins for being able to say, like, wait until another action is dispatched and then continue, or pause until this promise resolves. It does have some cancellation capabilities built in, which are something that you would typically need sagas or observables to do. And even has like this notion of child tasks and being able to kick off like bits of sub-processes in your logic. So we've tried to replicate most of the things that you could do with sagas or observables, but with an API that's smaller, simpler, easier to understand, and works better with TypeScript. Still on time. Yay. A couple other things. I said earlier that mutations have always been the biggest source of bugs with Redux Toolkit, or with Redux in general. Redux Toolkit automatically builds in some dev check middleware that watch for accidental mutations. And on top of that, Immer by itself basically eliminates mutations as a source of bugs. I spend a lot of my time answering questions in Discord, and I can tell you that the number of times people ask about, like, why is my UI not updating when I dispatch an action, has dropped dramatically since Redux Toolkit came out. What does this look like using with TypeScript? We really, really want people to use TypeScript with Redux Toolkit. And we've got a fairly straightforward set of patterns that we now teach as the default approach. You infer a root state and like an app dispatch type from your store setup. We then have a way to predefine hooks that have the state and dispatch types built in. And that way you call those hooks and the rest of your components, and they've got the right types already set up. And that eliminates some common concerns over like having to copy paste the root state type or trying to dispatch something that you're not allowed to. So generally the pattern is in one of these slice files, you would have the type for your initial state in the slice. You pass it to create slice. In each of the case reducers, you say, here is the type of the payload field in the action. And then Redux Toolkit passes that action type through so that the various action creators have the correct types applied. So we've really tried to infer as many of the TypeScript types as possible so that your code stays a lot simpler. We have a couple templates for Create React App with Redux Toolkit built in. As some of you may have noticed recently, Create React App is no longer in favor with the React team. We would like to try to add an official Vue template in the near future. We haven't gotten around to doing so yet. If you Google for like Redux template Vue or something like that, there is an unofficial template that is basically the same thing, and we're probably just going to borrow that and make it official or something in the near future. There is a Next template called With Redux that does have the basic store set up in there. I will say that using Redux with Next is more complicated because of the multi-page architecture. Writing a docs page on how to set up Redux with Next properly has been on my to-do list for like 3 years now, and I still haven't gotten to it. Basically, as long as it's on the client side, it's still relatively simple. When you start trying to do the data fetching on the server and pass it to Redux on the client, it gets more complicated. So we're still trying to work on some improvements here. A couple other points. 1 year ago, actually, I was sitting in the back row in, well, not this auditorium, the auditorium on the other side of the hall. And I published Redux 4.2.0, which officially marked the original Create Store API as deprecated. Many people have yelled at me about this. They're wrong. The reason is we don't want people using the low-level Redux APIs. You shouldn't be using the original Create Store function yourself. You shouldn't be writing reducers by hand because Redux Toolkit makes this simpler and safer and easier to use. But a lot of people are learning Redux in boot camps or from outdated Medium posts from 2017, and I can't fix that. And I've also learned they don't read our documentation. So the only way I had to try to improve this situation was to mark the original Create Store function as deprecated so that when they import it in their editor, they'll see the little strike through. And then hopefully look at the tooltip and then look at the documentation and learn about Redux Toolkit, please. So it still runs. We're not going to break anything, even in this next major version we're about to put out. But we want people using Redux Toolkit, not the original core API by itself. So please, we're not breaking anything, but when you see that little strike through, please follow the instructions. Matt Pocock, who used to work on XState and does a lot of TypeScript stuff, pointed out that there's no other library where the gap between what we maintainers are trying to tell people to do versus what outdated tutorials say to do online is so huge. Okay, so almost done, still staying on time. Yes. Right now, we are very actively working on Redux Toolkit 2.0. We have several goals. The first one is trying to have proper ES module common JS package compatibility. I've been working on this for months and I'm still not sure I could properly define that phrase. But whatever it is, we're trying to get there. We want to have modern JS build output. We want to drop support for IE11 and everything else. We want to have smaller bundle sizes. We are having some small breaking changes, which are documented, and we've got some warnings and code mods even with Redux Toolkit 1.9. We are adding a few new features. Also, we converted the Redux core to TypeScript in 2019, and it still hasn't shipped. So we finally want to ship that as Redux 5.0. So I published Redux Toolkit 2.0 Alpha 5 like 3 days ago. Here's what we've got. I've updated the packaging, so it should have, I hope, proper ESMCJS compatibility, although I'm sure about 3 people will pop up on Twitter and tell me I'm still doing it wrong. We've modernized the build artifacts to have modern JS output. Basically, we're not transpiling anything. If you still need to target IE11, that's your problem. I'm sorry. Immer 10 just came out. It has a smaller bundle size, and it is much faster. I am very excited about this. We include Redux Core 5.0 Alpha, which has improved TypeScript types and some tweaks. We've improved some of Redux Toolkit's types and store setup as well. Killed a couple deprecated features, and we are working on a couple new APIs. When will this come out? I don't know. Soon, I hope. It would be very easy to get stuck in, it's a major version. Let's just keep throwing new features in there. I'm going to hopefully try to keep it scoped so it's in the next 3-ish months instead of next year. But I can't, we don't have a hard exact set of what's going in, so we can't tell you when it's going to get done. Also, there's the whole, working on this in our spare time thing. But the alphas are live. They work. It's alpha more in the sense of we don't know what the final contents will be, but they should work stably. So please try those out in your real applications and give us feedback on what works and what doesn't, as well as what you would like to see inside. So final slide. I am technically out of time. Redux Toolkit is the way. We want people using Redux today. We have specifically designed it to solve the problems that people are running into in real-world Redux applications and to try to make all your Redux usage patterns simpler. If you're doing any data fetching at all, you should be using RTK query for that. So one other thought, you can have an existing legacy Redux application and migrate to Redux Toolkit piece by piece over time. I've done it myself in a couple of different applications on my day job, and we have a migrating to modern Redux page in our docs that tells you how to do it. If you got any questions, please come to talk to me afterwards or find me online because you mentioned Redux, I'll show up somewhere. So please use Redux Toolkit. Thank you. Have a great day.